Hi, this is the second of two films on the book The Great Derangement by Amitav Ghosh, with the first of those setting out what the main ideas of the book were, and in this second film moving to critique those ideas. And from the discussions of our book club, this is something of a Marmite book, and I've sought to give quite a forceful expression to both the arguments of its detractors as well as those of its admirers, which here are naturally enough organised into two sections, each divided into three subheadings, so that in the first section I'll look at the criticisms which claim that the book is difficult, unbalanced, underdeveloped, overstated, and offers little in the way of remedies. While in the second half I'll present the perspective of its admirers, claiming it to be clear-eyed, fresh and creative, and insightful and effective. So starting with the detractors then, and really the biggest complaint here is just how difficult a book this is. It's dense in language and argument and really demands a lot from its readers, with a blizzard of names and arguments and often very complex ideas which seem to fall on the reader mostly without any kind of explanation, either on the page itself or in references at the back of the book. So that, in a matter of seconds, readers have to absorb a succession, some might say a barrage, of ideas such as the mathematics of war and peace, the chemistry in Alice in Wonderland, the deep state, and the radical turn from the non-human to the human generated by the politics of the Cold War. And this is really difficult material, and it's not made any easier by its unusual style, loose in structure, with its themes spiralling and circulating and constantly breaking free from the book's headings. So that there is often a sense, or at least I felt so, that things just aren't in the right place, with a discussion on cities and globalisation included in the section on literature, and the failings of literature included in the section on politics. And in that sense, I was reminded a little bit of Adam Curtis, with his trademark random leaps between, across and around all sorts of ideas. And because of this, some find it an inaccessible, even an alienating book, whose scholarship, while never in doubt, works at times to distance rather than to enrich, and which, for all its well-articulated and poetic eloquence, leaves some readers feeling inadequate in the reading and unsure of what it was that they'd actually read. What was that argument again? And even if this is a treasure trove of what in the previous film I described as a cornucopia of vignettes and encounters, predictions and personal stories, historical survey and political argument. All of this is packed and crammed and crowded into just 162 pages, leaving very little room not just to explain those ideas, but to develop and expand what are often really interesting lines of argument. For instance, how his theory of the novel builds on the earlier insights of the Marxist Yohi Lukács, who was the first to argue how the novel emerged from the forces and the conditions of capitalism. Or Edward Said, who does the same for imperialism. Or to use another example, what exactly does he mean by the deep state? An idea which in social science used to be specifically applied to the Turkish state, but which is all over the place today, frequently used but rarely defined. And for others there is something unbalanced about a book about climate change which gives twice as much time to a discussion on literature as it does to history and politics. Similarly, some find his claims overstated. So for instance, that the safe and bourgeois novel banishes both nature and any kind of collective expression of class or race or gender, which in a strange way seemed to me constantly challenged by his own numerous examples to the contrary, including Zola's visceral account of class war in Germinal and Cormac McCarthy's dystopian The Road. And even the quintessentially bourgeois Jane Austen surely has a feminist subtext between her lines. And I think there could be a number of other examples, perhaps the most definitive being Conrad's wonderful short story Typhoon, which isn't included in the book, a story of race, racism and rank, in which Captain McWhirr ignores the storm literature, his own scientific instruments and the advice of his second-in-command to calmly take his steamship, transporting 200 Chinese labourers, right into the eye of a tropical hurricane. A character who is surely the very epitome of Ghosh's derangement, and who, in the words of Conrad, was ignorant of life to the last, without ever having been made to see all it may contain of violence and of terror, and who had never been given a glimpse of the immeasurable strength and the immoderate wrath and fury of the passionate sea, so that he was unable to discover the message of a prophecy until its fulfilment had been brought to his very door. Now that was published in 1902, but a similarly perfect illustration of Ghosh's arguments might be John Lanchester's current novel, The Wall, precisely echoing Ghosh's withering assessment of how our security state responds to climate change with the politics of the armed lifeboat. And there are loads of other cultural products like Susanna Clarke's wonderful Piranesi or the film Don't Look Up, which offer in very different ways reflections on our relationship to nature, as well as our current predicament as we ignore every warning and rush towards climate catastrophe. And finally, there are some, especially perhaps some climate activists, who may be just a tad disappointed that his stark analysis suggests that they've actually been wasting their time, while offering little in the way of an alternative approach. And as one critic put it, it's doubtful whether fiction can remedy the political and economic intransigence standing in the way of effective action, or the likelihood that religion will somehow inspire mass movements which will transcend our individualism and the myopia of the nation state, which he suggests is like looking to God to bail us out of jail from religions which just as frequently consider catastrophe as acts of divine will. Now, of course, for the book's admirers, not only are these arguments completely unfair, but they argue that what the critics see as weaknesses might be better seen as strengths, believing the book to be clear-eyed, fresh and creative, and insightful and effective. Yes, this is a gloomy book, but it's also a clear-sighted one, and it's pessimistic because there's much to be pessimistic about. After what many see as the grandstanding, empty rhetoric and the hollowness of COP26, his analysis of the 2015 Paris Agreement seems well grounded. And perhaps we don't need footnotes to see how progressive politics is ever more paralysed by its descent into contested identities, or how democratic states are fast becoming security states, more concerned to wargame climate change than to remedy it. And it's the very unorthodox style, the swirling ideas and non-linear argument which did so much to alienate its critics, but which for others are the fresh and creative perspective of a novelist who by turns surprises, captivates and turns round our preconceptions, addressing the imaginative, the cultural and the unexamined dimensions of our deluded and willful failure to take climate change seriously. From city planning to performance politics, Ghosh, they argue, weaves a tapestry of delusion, myopia and derangement in stark and strange colours, seeding ideas like the uncanny, letting them ruminate and then return in stories and metaphors such as the armed lifeboat and of course the Great Derangement itself, all of which these admirers find fresh and arresting. So for those not alienated and who can persist beyond its demanding and dense difficulties, this is an insightful synthesis and a rich weave of really interesting material, which snakes and meanders like the multiple streams of the Sundarbans, but heads unerringly to his destination in clarifying the climate catastrophe already upon us. And even for those well informed about climate change, it's full of new angles, insights, complexities and ironies about culture, which for so long has stopped us thinking about the elephant in the room, about history full of irony and unintended consequence, and about politics, where identity wars denude its power for progressive change, and is increasingly marked by the cynicism of those who truly have power. And because at times it reads like a thriller, works with metaphor and looks to the psychological, for its admirers this is a gripping, instructive and perspective-altering book. For me, I fall somewhere between these two positions. I think the detractors are right in pointing to the difficulty of this book, and it's a difficulty that seems to come not from the book's content, but from the author's rather unuser-friendly style. But knowing that this is a book which was generated from a series of lectures in 2015 helps explain a good deal, especially for me, about those areas that might be better structured and more fully developed. And I would have liked this to have been a fuller and more expansive book. But with that in mind, this I think is a rich and worthwhile book, whose stark message that we have to transform not only how we live, but how we imagine we should live, is both very urgent and very relevant.